All right, in this video I'm going to show you guys just how to get started on a website using some of the files that I like to start with. I start every website with these files. I'm going to show you a couple of things in the track site, and we're just going to do a quick verbal overview of HTML and CSS, kind of the rules behind it, some of the simple tags you're going to use, and that sort of thing. Most of these tags you'll use over and over and over again, and the rules you'll use over and over and over again, of course. So let's start by going to our track site. We've got the in the resources tab. If we'll go down to starter HTML and look in that folder, you'll find my HTML5 template rwd.zip. So go ahead and grab that. I'll just right click on it and say save link as on my desktop here, as a zip file here, and I'll just save it in my desktop. And I start every site with this kind of starter kit. It's basically my file structure and some CSS resets to help work with old browsers and those sorts of things. And I'll kind of walk you through those as we look at them. So I'm going to hide my browser, and I'm going to go look for my file here. Sorry, it's on my desktop. Here you go. HTML5 template rwd.zip. I always kind of have that on this laptop whenever I'm working. I'll have it on my memory stick if I move between computers. This is kind of what I use to start every exercise and every website that I ever build. So I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to leave my zip file alone, and I'm going to have a folder here, and I'm just going to rename my folder so I can just hit return as I've got my folder selected. I'm just going to call this review, and this will be my review folder. I'm going to open up that review folder and take a look at what's inside. You'll see I have a folder for my images. There's nothing in there, but that's where all of my images are going to go for my entire website. I've got my index.html. That's my home page, and every home page has to be called index. It can't be called home. It can't be called first. It always has to be called index. The reason being is that on your laptop it kind of doesn't matter, but once you upload that to a website, an actual web server, the very first thing that web server is going to do, whenever you type in www.whatever.com, is it's going to look for a file called index.html, and it's going to assume that that is the first page in that site. You can call the other pages anything you want, as long as it's all lowercase, no funky special characters in the name, and no spaces in the file name. But your home page always has to be called index.html. You're also going to find a folder called JS. This is JavaScript, and there's a couple of files in there. Don't worry about those too much. Those are what are called modernizers, and it basically fixes some stuff for really old browsers that just kind of automatically fixes things. So you don't have to mess with them too much. I'll show you where they get called in the index a little bit later. And then you have your style.css, and that's my style sheet. That's controlling my entire website. It's kind of like the Lord of the Rings, one style sheet to rule them all. If you've got 50 or 60 pages in your website, you want one style sheet that controls all 50 or 60 pages. One thing that really helps you with that is that, let's say you've got a paragraph style that you use throughout your entire 50-60 page website. You go into your one style.css file, make your change to that one paragraph, and save it. Boom, all 50 or 60 pages are fixed. You don't have to mess with it. And that's why you don't have a separate style for each individual page. So you may have more than one index, or I'm sorry, not more than one index. You have one index, more than one HTML file in your site, but you rarely ever have more than one CSS file. There are occasions when you do need more than one, but for our purposes, you really don't. So I'm going to go open these up in my editor. Now I'm using brackets. I'm going to go ahead and click on index, command click on style so I can click in the middle, and then I'm going to drag these down to brackets and open that up. Now to get brackets is the editor that we're going to be using for our class. If you go back to resources and go to software downloads, you'll see a couple of pieces of software that you can use. So the very first one is Brackets. It's a free piece of software. Adobe just bought it, but it's still free, and it works on both Windows and Mac, and I believe Linux as well. So you can use that as our main editor, and I really do like it. I used to use another one called Komodo Edit, and this is I do have a link to Komodo Edit. It's an alternative to Brackets. It's for if you have a very old machine at home and cannot run Brackets. Brackets needs I believe OS 9 or I'm sorry, iOS 10 or sorry, OS 10 9.0 or above, I believe. If you've got an older version and it won't run, you can use Komodo Edit instead. It's just as good. We'll go over these other software downloads a little bit later for doing other things, but Brackets and or Komodo Edit are the ones we're going to use. So I'm going to use Brackets. All right. So let's take a look first at our index, and we'll just kind of take a look at the starter here. And you'll see that it's very simple. It's just kind of starting us off with a blank page. And in fact, if you look and you open up Index in Google Chrome, you'll see that there's really nothing there. I'll see page title, I'll see my file address, but nothing's in there. It's just a white background. I'll go back to Brackets. So here's how it's structured. We've got our HTML tags, and then it has a beginning tag and an end tag. All HTML, except for very few cases that I'll point out here in a minute, have open and closed tags. So you'll see an open HTML, and then you'll see a closed HTML. You might see stuff in the middle of the opening tag, and those are modifiers that we'll talk about in a little bit later. You'll also see, so this is basically saying, hey, this is an HTML file, that's what it is. We also have a head section here as well, and this is where we load things that generally the user doesn't see a whole lot, except for a couple of things. The title is one of the things that they do see, and so we'll just call this one Practice. You'll see it has a title and a closed title, just like regular tags. You'll also see a meta name description. This is for search engines, and so you can actually type in content here. So you would type in kind of a short description of what this site is. So this is a practice review site for class. Now this one, the meta tag, and the next one, the link tag that we'll talk about, is one of the few ones that do close within themselves. They don't have an open and a close. Images are that way. This link to my style sheet is that way as well. But for the most part, they do have open and closed, separate open and closed tags. But whenever you see a space, slash, and a bracket, that means it's closed within itself. All right. So here's, I've got a little comment here. I've got comments to say, hey, this is a link to my main style sheet. This is how you do a comment, and they're very handy. We'll talk about comments when we talk about troubleshooting a little bit later. And then here's my link to my style.css. This is the link to my style sheet right there. And that's that file that is it's this right here, but it's also in my folder right here. So that's what that is loading up. And then it's also got a script that's loading in from my JS folder. That's what this JS slash means. That slash means a folder. Whenever you see a slash in there, that's the JS folder there. And it's looking for a file called modernizer.js. That's that JavaScript file that I said just kind of ignore for now. It's kind of the thing that kind of helps us with older browsers. Then we also have another meta tag. This should be corrected there. This meta tag right here makes it so it's kind of the first step of making something responsive. So for right now, we're just going to leave it in there. We're not going to talk about it too much until we get to responsive, but we'll just kind of know that that is there. Then you've got your body section, and the body section is actually where everything lives that your viewer wants to see. That's everything that you put in the body section will show up in your main kind of canvas. So this is where we're going to do most of our practice. So let's talk about tags and what kind of tags that we all deal with on a normal basis. So as I said, HTML tags always start with a bracket. They usually have a letter or a series of letters in them. And they always end with a bracket. The first part of the tag always ends with a bracket, a letter or word, or part of a letter or part of a word, another bracket, and then they always end with the exact same text in here with a slash in there. So paragraph slash paragraph. So that's how you do just a simple paragraph. And then whatever is in between these two tags, that's your content. So this is a paragraph. Period. So I'm going to save that, and then I'll go back to my browser and I'll just take a look at it. And I don't have to keep on dragging my file back and forth to my browser. If I just already have that file loaded, I can just hit refresh here, or Command R also does the same thing. And you'll see that my title tag has changed and I've got a paragraph in there. It doesn't look like much. There's no space around it because we haven't really told it to be anything yet. That's where our CSS comes in. That's how we tell it to what to look like. But our HTML is kind of giving a structure to our, and it's like the content and the structure. The CSS is the layout and the styling, what it looks like. So we'll talk about a couple of different tags. So paragraph tag is the first one. There's also other tags for text, like your headers. So that would be an H1 would be the most important header. And then you have all the way down to H6. So I've got H1. Maybe I've got, after my paragraph, I've got an H2. And I might have a paragraph or two in there. And I might have an H3. And so on and so forth. And these are your headers or your subheads. So in your layout. So this might be the title of the entire page. You might have a few paragraphs, and then you might have a couple of extra subsections. So let's say in this case I'm selling socks. So best athletic socks on the market. And I might have a section called red socks. And I might have a section called sock care, right? So maybe, or let's say I'll say training socks. So maybe my training socks or socks for sale. I'll make it socks for sale. That's more important. So I might have a bunch of socks for sale in this section. So that's pretty important. And then sock care is, you know, kind of a sort of important thing, but it's not that important. So H1s are generally, from a style perspective, they're the bigger, the bolder fonts on in your design. They're also the most important things in the page, right? Your H2s are going to be second most biggest in size and boldest, and maybe they're second most important on the page. H3s are going to be down the line. H4s, 5s, and 6 are going to be much smaller and much less important in information. So when I say important, I mean from a hierarchy standpoint, from a type hierarchy standpoint, or from a information hierarchy standpoint. One, it's for your reader to kind of know, you know, hey, what's the title of this page, and, you know, what sections, how is this page made into sections, but also for search engine optimization, like Google. So Google's going to look at this page now and say, hey, they sell athletic socks, because that's in an H1. It's going to look at that H1 at the very first. It's going to say, hey, they sell athletic socks. And then by the time you get down to H3, Google's like, oh, okay, yeah, it says something to do with socks, but it's not that important. The information in the H1s and the H2s are much more important to Google. So I've got my H's and stuff like that. I got my paragraphs in there. We'll save it. We'll just kind of take a look. And again, there's not much hierarchy there because I haven't really styled it in any way, form, or fashion, but I will here in a little bit. So let's move over to our CSS and let's get this styled just a little bit. So the way that you talk, so your CSS is loaded through this link here. And that's saying, hey, go take a look at my style.css file, and that's how I'm going to style all these things. But if you look at my style.css, I've got a lot of garbledy-gook up here, and then I don't really have anything talking to my H's or my paragraphs yet. I'm going to do that in here in just a minute. But let's just take a look at what we've got up here at the top. A lot of this you can just kind of ignore. This is all kind of what's called the Myers reset. And this Myers reset is kind of, again, it's one of those things to kind of take care of some problems with old browsers and fix issues that you might run into with old browsers. I'm going to scroll all the way down here, and I'm going to hit return a couple times. And a couple things we'll talk about a little bit later. This image and this HTML stuff here, the styling here, we'll talk about that and what that does a little bit later. But for the first part, let's keep on talking about our paragraphs and our H's. So if I wanted to just talk to all of the H's in my site, if it's an H1, I just want to talk to all the H1s, no matter how many H1s I have, I can just talk to them straight through the tag itself. So if I want to just talk to my H1s, I can just type in H1 and then use my curly braces. So the way that CSS is structured is that you have your call to whichever tag, or when we talk about it here in a minute, class or ID that you want to talk to. And then you have a beginning opening brace and an end brace. Be very careful that you always end your braces, because if you don't, and you start drawing, well, I'm going to do my H2s now, and open one up, that's going to nest your H1 into your H2. See, it turned red, your H2 and your H1. It turned red saying, hey, there's something problem here. So if you see that color change, look up above and make sure that you're closing. Now I've closed my H1, and then I could go on. All right, in all of my in all of my H's and paragraph styles, this is where you style your text. Some people like to style it outside of these tags in your div tags that we'll talk about a little bit later, and I'm sure you'll kind of remember what those were. But I don't. I like to keep my text styles separate from my box styles, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So here's some example things that you can do with your text. So I can do things like color. So I have a couple of choices. I can, if I wanted to, go in here and choose some of my colors here, from some kind of pre-made ones. If I don't care what the color is, let's say I'm kind of troubleshooting, or I'm just kind of putting things in roughly, I can actually type out red. But if, since I'm a designer, I want a specific color of red. So I'm going to go snag that from Illustrator. I'll snag a nice color of red here, and I'll grab my hex style from there. And the hex style always starts with a pound sign, and then you've got your hex code. I could type in red, green, blue, whatever. Sometimes I'll do that in these demos just for saving time, but I'll do that. And then every line in your CSS always has to stop with a semicolon. Don't forget that. If you put a new line here, let's say font family, and let's say I forgot to put that in there, and I start typing in Verdana, blah, blah, blah. You see it's black and not purple like it should be. That means there's something wrong. And so if I didn't have that semicolon here, it's going to break every line of CSS after that until I get to my close of my declaration. So always make sure you've got a semicolon there. All right, so back to our next line. So I'm going to tell it what font to be. So font families. I always start with, if I don't have a Google font that I'm working with, I always have my standard fonts that are come on every machine. And those are things like Verdana, Helvetica, Arial. And then if nobody has those on their machine, sans serif. The important thing to remember here in HTML in websites, fonts are not transferable. So if you have a font on your machine, your website looks great. But if they don't have, your user doesn't have a font on their machine, it defaults down to another kind of like default font. So you always have to have some fallbacks of your standardized typefaces. So in sans serif world, that's Verdana, Helvetica, Arial. In serif world, that's Georgia, Times New Roman, Times, and Courier, those types of things. So the reason why I'm listing these out in order like this with commas after them is because Verdana, I might spell that correctly. Verdana, there you go. Is because if I put in Verdana first, it's going to look at that first and say, okay, I want to use Verdana. If somebody doesn't have Verdana on their machine, it then goes to Helvetica. And then if somebody doesn't have Helvetica on their machine, then it goes to Arial. If somebody doesn't have any of these three, it will then go to, it will choose automatically any sans serif they can find on that person's machine. Most of the time, they will have these here. They won't be deleted. All right. So those are called your fallbacks. Always important to put those, even if you're using Google Fonts or Typekit fonts later on when we get to that. Then we want font size. And I'm saying then we want, it doesn't matter what order you put these in. You can put font size first, whatever. I sometimes have a habit of doing them in certain orders, and sometimes I don't. It just kind of depends on my mood for the day. But as long as I get them in there. All right. So my font size is going to be a little different from the print world. Where in the print world we're used to using points. In HTML and websites we use REMs or REMs, responsive M's. And the calculation to figure out what font size it is whatever font you have. I'm going to go over to a scratch pad here. Whatever font size you're looking for. So let's say I want 32 point typeface divided by 16. And that is going to equal our REMs. So whatever your target is, whatever your target size, divided by 16, this is our common denominator, will give you our REMs. So if I go to my calculator, I'm bad at doing math in my head, I'll do 32 divided by 16. That's going to be 2 REMs exactly. So that's what I'm going to do. It's important that you don't use points, especially when you get to responsive web design like we are in this class, because 32 points on a phone and 32 points on a desktop are going to look very, very different. And even browsers kind of show them a little different. It has to do a lot with whether you're on a Retina display or an HD display or a standard size display, a standard density display. And so REMs kind of keep it much more consistent. 2 REMs on a phone and 2 REMs on a desktop will look the right size. They'll be a lot more consistent. Same thing with line height, and that's your padding, or I'm sorry, not your padding, your leading. So line height we also do in rims as well. And so you at least want one rim of line height. You may need more at the very least. And one rim is equal to about 16 points. If you do 16 over 16, that equals one rim. So that's my line height. I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to take a look and see where we are. Okay. So I need a little bit more space. One rim's not enough. I'm going to go up to 2 rims. Oops. And see how that works. Much better. Okay. All right. Now, let's say that's my line height. So let's say that I want to add a little bit of space around my H to kind of give it a little bit of space after, before and after, and maybe on the side of my H1. Well, I can do that by adding my margin. Now, margin that we'll talk about here and padding, which is another kind of concept, are a little different. So let's say here's my box, here's my text, or my div, or whatever I'm working on. Margin goes on the outside of the box. It pushes against the outsides of the box here. So whatever spacing I want, it goes right here on the outside. Padding, we'll talk about a little bit later. Padding is actually spacing on the inside of items, not on the outside. So I generally like to mess with margins before I mess with my padding. So I'll just do margins in this example. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of margin top of, let's say, 2 rim. A little bit of margin bottom of, let's say, 2 rim. And I'm just guessing, so I can tweak this a little bit later. I can maybe make it a little bit less. And then margin left is always done in percents. So left and rights in percents, tops and bottoms, and font sizes in rims. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of margin left just to kind of push it away from the edge. And let's see what that looks like. Great. I've got some spacing around stuff, and that looks good. I might crank that down to about 2.5%, so it's not so far off to the left. So I've got a little bit more even spacing there. All right. So now I'm going to do that. Now I'm going to take a look at my other items. So I've got my H1s done. I need to fix my H2s, my H3s, and my paragraphs. So I'm going to take a look at my H2s. And I always like to kind of keep my H's together, and then I'll work on my paragraphs a little bit different. So I'm going to do, basically, I'm just going to copy this, since I don't have to type new stuff every single time. And I'm going to crank this down in font size to about 1.5 rims. I'll go down a half a rim. I'll go down, I'll keep my line height at 2, just to kind of keep my baseline the same. I'll keep my margins and everything like that the same. Maybe I want to give this a little bit of a different style. Maybe I want to italicize it perhaps, or something along those lines. So I might say font style italic. So maybe I give this a little bit of flair there and make my socks for sale that way. And then my H3, I'm just going to copy the whole thing. My H3, maybe that's not as important. It's definitely not as important as my H1 and my H2. I might change that to a gray. I'll do that. 6. I'll do a kind of a gray color here, kind of medium gray. I'm going to crank that down to 1 rim. I'll probably want to adjust my line height here at this point, because it's going to have a lot of space around it. I am going to keep my margins about the same as well, and my font style and margin left and well. So I'll just kind of do that. So I've got kind of my hierarchy set up here. I've got the most important thing to talk about, my second most important thing, and then something that's maybe not quite so important. All right, and then now I'm going to go and style my paragraphs. So my paragraphs, if I want all my paragraphs to look the same, I can do it just like that. Just talk to my paragraph with my p tag, and then I've got my style that I want to do. So I'm going to do my color, I'll do as black. I just remember that 6 zeros is black, 6 F's is white. Everything else I've got to look up in Illustrator or Photoshop to figure out what color I want. Font family, I'm going to kind of mix it up a little bit. I'm going to use I'm going to pair this with a serif typeface. I'm going to start with Georgia. Times New Roman times Courier serif. All right, so new question. Why did I have Times New Roman in quotes? In certain cases where you have a font that is named more than one thing, like it's the word, it's Times New Roman is 3 words. If I didn't have these quotes around it, it would think it's Times New and then Roman fonts. So you put these quotes around there so it knows it's one font when it's multiple words in the name. The rest of these don't have fonts because they're one-word names. So I'm going to do that. I'm also going to give myself a font size of 1 rem and a line height of 1 rem as well. To start, I might crank that out a little bit more. In between each paragraph, I might want some spacing. So I am going to do a margin bottom on my paragraphs. I don't need to do a margin top because I've already got the big margin bottoms on my H's already. So I'm just going to put a margin bottom on my paragraphs to separate my paragraphs of 2 rems as well, just to kind of keep my baseline there. And we might come back and take a look. We might kind of look at this and say, hey, this is way too big. I also want to align my margins correctly with the rest of my typeface as well, or the rest of my H's. So I've got my margin right of 2.5% as well. Oops, sorry, margin left, margin right, my bad. Doop. Now they're all kind of stuck together. Now I'm kind of looking at this and I'm thinking, you know, I don't like this equidistant stuff here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this space here, but I'm going to reduce the space in between my first paragraph and my H2 and my first paragraph and my H3. But I want to kind of keep these guys. So I'm going to reduce that bottom margin on my 2s and 3s just to kind of give it a little bit less space there. So I'm going to change this down to 1 rem on that and 1 rem on my margin bottom and see how that looks. That's looking a little bit better. I also think my paragraphs are way spaced out. So I'm going to bring my margin bottom on my paragraphs down to 1.5 and see if that helps me out a little bit. Let's go down to 1. See if that helps me out a little bit. Much better. So now I've got a much better hierarchy of H1s, H2s, and this looks like it's a separate piece from this piece. Before, everything was kind of equidistant, so it didn't look like it was, it didn't look like separate sections. Now they're a little bit more compartmentalized, and I could actually reduce some of that spacing or increase some of the spacing in between here and here if I wanted to a little bit later. But that gets me started on the text stuff. So I'll be back with another video on divs in a little bit.